Khaled Elgindy, Director of the Middle East Institute's Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs, and Adjunct Instructor in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Khaled is the author of Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump. Elgindy previously served as a resident scholar in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And prior to arriving at Brookings, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 8. Khaled, we welcome you to Middle East Peace Now.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you for the work that you're doing. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Can everyone see?
Yes, you're
Yes.
good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about the situation in Gaza, both on the ground and in terms of the political or diplomatic process. But before I do that, I think it's useful to sort of give an overview of the situation before October 7th of last year, as context. We are often told that there was a ceasefire in place on October 6th, and that's why that Hamas unilaterally disrupted that, and therefore everything that is happening is essentially justified on that basis. Um, if we look at the almost 16-year period before October 7th of last year, we get a different picture. In that 16-year period, the total number of Israelis killed, and I'm talking here about political violence between Israel and Palestine, not other kinds of violence. But Israelis were very comfortable in that time period. It was a time of economic progress, of Israel was being integrated into the region in unprecedented ways, and the security situation for Israelis was unparalleled. A total of 310 Israelis were killed in that almost 16-year period. Half of those were soldiers in the various Gaza wars, mainly. So an even tinier number of civilians. In that same time period, the situation was not so great for Palestinians. More than 20 times the number of Palestinians were killed. Again, mostly in the context of the various Gaza wars in 2009, 2014, 2021. And most of those killed were civilians, as is the norm, essentially. It's very asymmetrical, both in terms of Israeli and Palestinian casualties, but also in terms of civilian versus combatant casualties. So when people say that there was a ceasefire in place in Gaza before October 7th, what they actually mean is that Israelis felt safe. Palestinians did not feel safe. Obviously, the situation has worsened considerably for Palestinians in almost unimaginable ways, and we'll talk about that. But it's useful to put in perspective, because on October 7th, of course, if you think about 300 some being killed over a 16-year period, 4 times as many were killed, as many Israelis were killed in a single day. So obviously, for Israelis, this was the deadliest single day in the country's history and a major national trauma. In addition to the 250 hostages who were taken back then. Since then, about 100 or so were released, mostly last year as a part of a temporary ceasefire deal, and attempts at new ceasefire deals have repeatedly failed. For Palestinians, this has been the deadliest single event and largest forced displacement in their entire history. It is also one of the deadliest and most destructive wars of the 21st century. In the wake of October 7th, Israeli leaders made their intentions very clear. President Herzog declared that there were no innocents in Gaza. Israeli military commanders promised to flatten Gaza, to turn it into a city of tents. Israeli military spokesman Daniel Hagari said that the focus is on damage, not on precision. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant at that time said he was releasing his soldiers of all restraints and promised that Gaza will never go back to what it was. All of these promises actually came to pass. At the same time, Defense Minister Gallant at that time also declared that there would be no food, fuel, electricity, or anything entering Gaza because, quote, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. So the results of this have been what we've been seeing on our screens for the past 14 and a half months. It's impossible to overstate the scale of death and destruction inflicted on Gaza and the magnitude of human suffering endured by its 2 million inhabitants over the past 14 and a half months. More than 85,000 tons of bombs, roughly equivalent to 5 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima, have been dropped on Gaza, which of course is a very densely populated small space. 45,000 killed at least. This is almost certainly an undercount because we know that many, many thousands more are buried under the rubble. Some estimates run as high as 180 or 200,000. We won't know until relief workers and journalists are allowed back into Gaza if and when there is ever a ceasefire. But the deaths, the killing of civilians has proceeded at an unprecedented pace. Around 75% of those killed are civilians. According to Air Wars, which is a humanitarian and human rights watchdog group that focuses on the way wars are conducted, they recently issued a pretty damning report. And according to Air Wars, and I'm going to quote here, by almost any metric, the harm to civilians from the first month of the Israeli campaign in Gaza is incomparable with any 21st century air campaign. It is by far the most intense, destructive, and fatal conflict for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented. In the first 25 days alone, at least 1,900 children were killed. That's 7 times higher than the deadliest month for children in any war previously recorded or studied by Air Wars. We've also seen unprecedented numbers of journalists killed, almost 200, aid workers, almost 400, medical staff, close to 1,000 have been killed. And all of these are sort of shattering records from other wars. And there's evidence that they are being deliberately targeted. For example, here is a tweet by the Israel Defense Forces, by the Israeli military, announcing what is essentially a hit list of 6 Palestinian journalists on the pretext that they are Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives. They're not accused of carrying anything but cameras and pens and devices. They are there's no pretense that they are armed in any way, but they are simply labeled as Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives and therefore marked for death. We've also seen aid workers, especially Palestinian ones, who have been directly targeted. Mahmoud al-Madhoun, just a few weeks ago over the Thanksgiving break, was killed by an attack drone. And the evidence is very, very strong that he was directly targeted by an Israeli quadcopter that killed him as he came out of his home. He was someone who he had set up food kitchens and was supplying food to the besieged, to one of the besieged hospitals in northern Gaza. And most recently, just in the last few days, another Israeli killer drone assassinated the last orthopedic surgeon in northern Gaza. In addition to the fact that we've seen, 70% of Gaza's housing stock has been destroyed, 80% of schools, all 14 of Gaza's universities, every one of Gaza's 36 hospitals has been bombed or attacked in some way. 19 have been permanently shut down. Only 17 are partially in service. And that number, of course, is dwindling every day, especially with what's happening in northern Gaza. Another interesting statistic, 70% of Gaza's agricultural lands have been destroyed. In other words, the very institutions that sustain life are being annihilated. Gaza is being rendered uninhabitable. Now, this is on top of mass starvation and disease. More than half of Gaza's population is on the verge of famine. Northern Gaza, parts of northern Gaza are already in famine. Dozens of children have died of malnutrition. According to Oxfam, Gaza is the fastest rate of starvation in history. And the starvation is not only man-made, but is a function of Israeli policy. Groups like Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Save the Children, the World Food Program have all concluded that Israel is using starvation as a weapon, as has UN Secretary General Guterres, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, and even the U.S. agents, even government agencies of the U.S. government, like USAID and the State Department's own Refugees Bureau, have all come to this same conclusion. Conditions are most dire in northern Gaza, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is why experts are calling it a genocide, and this is now a matter of growing consensus. As a reminder, genocide is defined by the Genocide Convention as it's a crime of intent. It's not about the number of people who are killed, but about the intent. And that is, the convention defines it as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Within the very first week of this war last October, Dr. Raz Sigal, an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, called it a textbook case of genocide. I believe he was the first genocide expert to do so. Since then, we've seen many other scholars come out, but also the International Court of Justice has taken up the case brought by South Africa against Israel, and they ruled in January that there was indeed a plausible risk of genocide and issued a series of provisional measures for Israel to take immediate steps to prevent the genocide and for the international community to do all it could to also prevent the genocide. All of those have been completely ignored. Some of you may have seen also earlier this month, Amnesty International became the first major human rights group in the world to officially declare Gaza as a genocide. I should also mention the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that case is centered around the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And so this is the common thread. So how did we get here, and why has this war been allowed to drag on for as long as it has? A war that almost all world leaders, including the Biden administration, have said has gone on too long, has taken too many, caused too much destruction, and taken too many innocent lives. And yet 6.5 months after Biden first released his ceasefire plan, there is still no end in sight to this war. And this has a lot to do with the political leaderships. We have essentially two extremist leaderships in place. One, Hamas, although Hamas has been severely degraded, and the other being the Israeli government, which I think, as most people understand, is the most extremist government in Israel's history. So each Hamas and the Netanyahu government have their own calculations, of course, for Hamas. The former leadership of Yahya Sinwar, who was recently assassinated, was much more radical than the leadership outside of Doha. And But the focus of Hamas has been to survive, to deny Israel the ability to say that Hamas has been destroyed, and in that at least they have succeeded. But it's not a military victory. It is at best a moral victory, merely to survive. For Israel and Netanyahu, there are a number of different calculations, I think, that have helped to prolong this war. For Netanyahu personally, he needs the war to continue for as long as possible for him to remain in power. There is no long-term strategy. There is no exit strategy. It is really, I think, really just about sustaining a kind of forever war to keep his extremist coalition partners satisfied, but also to prevent to delay the eventual reckoning that will have to take place for the failures of October 7th. And of course, as the sitting prime minister, it happened on his watch, and we would expect that there would be some accounting for that. And so he and the Israeli military establishment, when you factor in the humiliation of October 7th, the desire for revenge that we heard repeatedly from Israeli leaders, we get a sense of why this war has been carried out the way it has, with the brutality and ferocity and intensity that it has, as well as for why it doesn't seem to be able to end. But while the parties obviously bear responsibility, I think we also have to look at the U.S. role in particular as the single most influential actor in this arrangement. So I've divided the war into three phases. In the first phase of the war, this is when the U.S. offered unconditional support for Israel's offensive and all of its maximalist goals of wiping out Hamas, which was never really achievable, but the U.S. supported it nonetheless, and rejecting any and all calls for a ceasefire. This was basically right up until January of this year. And we were repeatedly told by the administration that they were not placing any red lines at all on Israel's conduct in Gaza. So this is what set the tone for everything that has come afterwards. During this time, the U.S. vetoed 3 separate ceasefire resolutions at the Security Council. They explicitly declared that there would be no red lines. And so the result of this was that Biden effectively gave Israel a virtual blank check to the most extreme government in Israel's history, headed by a desperate prime minister who would do anything to stay in power, and in a moment of unprecedented national trauma in Israel. Israel's violations were so grave that, as I mentioned, the ICJ said that genocide was plausible. It was also in this, even though the U.S. didn't lay out any red lines for Israel's conduct, they did put out a sort of vision for post-war Gaza in an attempt to put some guardrails on what Israel was doing. So things like there should be no forced displacement in Gaza, no reoccupation, no permanent reoccupation, no reduction of Gaza's territory. All of these have been completely eviscerated, ignored entirely by Netanyahu over the last 14 months. But all of this happened in the first phase. I think um, the lack of urgency the administration showed in that initial period was based on the idea that they expected this war to end early in 2024. But as the war dragged on, the administration had to adjust. Um, but at the same time, the message remained very, very conflicted. So they moved away from total opposition to the ceasefire to pushing for a limited ceasefire hostage deal. Um, you're probably familiar with the terms of that, a 6-week deal in 3 phases that would eventually lead to a de facto permanent end to the war. Um, at this time, also, the administration became more vocal about civilian harm and their frustration with Israel, although there was no follow through. So you may remember the refrain of the administration, which they're still saying today. It's almost like um, the press briefings in the White House and the State Department are kind of like a Groundhog Day scene, right? It's just the same talking points being repeated over and over with no change, even as the reality around us gets more and more severe. So they say things like Israel must do more to prevent civilian deaths and lift restrictions on aid. That has been the standard refrain for many, many months, but again, with no follow up. Instead, what we see is the U.S. take extraordinary steps, like airdrops. They built this, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on building a floating pier to facilitate the influx of humanitarian assistance. When the problem really wasn't a technical one, it wasn't a matter of, well, there aren't seaports or there aren't ways to get the aid into Gaza. There are 6 land crossings in Gaza. The problem was that Israel was heavily restricting that aid as a matter of policy. So instead of confronting that policy and compelling Israel to change course, the U.S. simply developed these workarounds like the airdrops and the floating piers, both of which were eventually abandoned because they weren't having any real impact. After the April 4th strike, an airstrike on the World Central Kitchen, which killed a number of foreign aid workers, the administration became extremely angry and issued a stark warning. Secretary Blinken said either Israel will change or U.S. policy would change. But again, very little changed, either in terms of Israel's conduct. There was a brief moment in which they allowed more truckloads of aid in and did a little bit better to coordinate with humanitarian aid groups. But the big picture remained the same. So 2 decisive moments, I think, confirmed for us that that the administration was never really serious about these threats or imposing any consequences on Israel or any constraints. The first was the National Security Memo 20, it's called, in which the administration, at the behest, was sort of forced to put together this memo requiring U.S. aid, requiring countries that receive U.S. assistance to demonstrate, to prove that they are using American military support in ways that are consistent with international humanitarian law and with U.S. law. The administration's hand was essentially forced by a couple Democratic senators, like Chris Van Hollen from Maryland. And so they did. They laid out. They requested this from Israel, and then what they did afterwards was essentially to give Israel a clean bill of health and say, nope, we don't see any real. They didn't say there were no violations of international law, because that would be absurd, because they're so well documented and so egregious and so massive. So instead, they sort of fudged the issue by saying, while it's reasonable to assume that violations occurred, we don't have any real concrete evidence on any specific case, and therefore, we're still it's still being investigated, and so we can't say conclusively this or that violation has happened. And so therefore, we're not going to change how we provide assistance, because under the Leahy law, the U.S. is prohibited from providing military assistance to governments that violate the laws of war, and also that restrict U.S. Humanitarian assistance. Israel has done both, but again, the administration just sort of fudged it to essentially give Israel a clean bill of health. The second moment that I think was very decisive was the so-called Rafah Red Line. Some of you may remember, after the Israeli army had kind of made its way southward, they destroyed Gaza City and the northern part, and then moved to the middle part, gradually pushing the population further and further south, until they were now all, most of the population was concentrated in the southern part on the Egyptian border at Rafah. And the administration intervened and said, and issued Israel a warning saying, do not go into Rafah. There's no place left for Palestinians to go except to be expelled into Egypt. That was the great fear at the time. And that there's no way to conduct a military operation, especially similar to what they had seen in the north and in the center of Gaza, without massive civilian casualties. And what did Netanyahu do? He called Biden's bluff. The Israeli army moved into Rafah. The U.S. suspended. They announced that they were withholding 2,000-pound bombs. But once it was clear that the invasion was occurring, the U.S. backed down. While they did suspend the most devastating bombs, the so-called bunker busters, the 2,000-pound bombs that basically destroy whole city blocks, there were no other actions taken after that. And instead, the administration resorted again to telling us, don't believe your lying eyes. They said it wasn't really an invasion. Israel hasn't violated the red line that President Biden laid out. And so there would be no need for any further measures beyond the suspension of that one exception of the 2,000-pound bombs. So once Netanyahu called Biden's bluff, he understood that he now had a free hand to expand the war and to do as he pleased. In that same moment, in early July, Hamas finally conceded a number of points. They had been demanding an explicit end, that any ceasefire deal include an explicit end to the war as a permanent ceasefire. They gave up that point in July, and everyone thought this is now the opportunity. Now that Hamas has climbed down from that place, this is the moment to clinch that ceasefire deal. But instead, what Netanyahu did was to escalate. He escalated on all fronts, in Gaza certainly, but also in the West Bank, in Lebanon. You're familiar with, I'm sure, the assassinations that happened. Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in the Iranian capital of Tehran. We also saw the invasion of Lebanon and the pager attack. I'm sure you remember those. And the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. And then Yahya Sinwar was killed, I believe, in August or September. We also saw the institution of what is called the General's Plan. Now, this is a plan that has been put together by former Israeli generals, and that Israel has denied implementing, but if you look at what's happening on the ground, it is identical to the general's plan. So the general plan calls for the total depopulation of northern Gaza and its kind of flattening to permanently render Gaza, that part of Gaza, uninhabitable. So there were about 300,000 or 400,000 people still trapped in the north. Israel denied them basically the flow of food and medicine came to a complete halt starting in early October, in an attempt to force them out of the pocket of northern Gaza and to flee southward, and in the process also engaged in airstrikes, mortar attacks, snipers, killer drones. Mahmoud al-Madhoun, the aid worker who I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was killed by a quadcopter in northern Gaza, again, for the crime of delivering food to one of the besieged hospitals. So it has been a no holds barred, absolute, anything goes in northern Gaza to force the population out. And I believe at this point, most of the population has fled. There are still pockets here and there, but this is where we've seen some of the most horrific images, like the young man who was, in a hospital bed, still attached to his IV, who was incinerated, who was, when Israel bombed the tents in front of one of the hospitals. And so in this moment came another kind of false threat from the administration. Because of the egregiousness of Israel's blockade of northern Gaza and the attacks there, Secretary Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin issued a joint letter to Israel warning them that if they did not take immediate steps, and they identified exactly what those steps were, to increase the number of trucks, which I think had been reduced to about 30 a day. So to increase them from about 30 a day to 350 trucks a day to Gaza. Before October 7th, Gaza was getting something like 500 trucks a day. 350 was the minimal needed for people just to live. Israel had cut that by more than 90%. So they had to dramatically increase the number of trucks going in. They had to back off of their threats to dismantle UNRWA, the UN agency that provides services to refugees, and that has been the backbone of the entire humanitarian effort in Gaza, and a number of other very detailed steps that Israel had to take. And Israel was given 30 days to implement these steps or face consequences. The consequences were generally understood to be withholding of US weapons, as required by US law. The 30 days came and went. International aid groups declared unanimously, the ones who are operating in Gaza issued a joint statement saying not only did Israel not comply and take these steps, but the humanitarian situation is even worse. So how did the administration respond? This was exactly another World Central Kitchen or Rafah Red Line moment. They lied, essentially. There's no other way to say it. They said Israel, there have been some improvements. There still needs to be more. But the fact that the number of trucks entering Gaza went from 30 to 70 was enough for them, even though it didn't come close to the 350 that was demanded. Israel still went ahead with the banning of UNRWA, which is supposed to go into effect at the end of January. So they ignored and violated all of these conditions, and yet the US came out and said, again, that Israel has taken enough steps that there's no need to withhold any weapons. Once again, in total violation of US law. So this is the kind of thing we've gotten consistently from the administration. And I'll wrap up now with some concluding thoughts. In sum, the reason that there is no ceasefire is because the US has not, as the chief mediator, has not worked to alter the basic cost and risk calculations of both sides, particularly Israel. Netanyahu has many incentives to continue the war and very few incentives to stop. The administration has given him even more incentives to continue by continuing to supply him with the weapons, and fewer incentives to stop since there are no consequences for not stopping. What I call the Biden doctrine has been from the beginning, we'd rather you didn't, but we'll still support you when you do. After Rafah, after the Blinken-Austin letter, it has been the same thing. There are no consequences. And the second reason, I think, is the unwillingness to call out Israel for its violations, or as being the primary obstacle to the lack of a ceasefire. Instead, they are just sort of rewriting the reality, even though Hamas has again made concessions just recently. They have they've made new concessions, but instead the Biden administration is insisting that Israel has accepted all the ceasefire plans and only Hamas is to blame and only Hamas is holding out. So their focus has been much more on managing the narrative, even when it flies in the face of what we see and hear with our own eyes and ears. And so the message has consistently been, don't believe your lying eyes. And so, again, they've let Israel totally off the hook. There's no question in my mind that the Biden policy has been a complete and unmitigated failure, legally, morally, politically, diplomatically, and in almost every conceivable way. And there will be massive costs, and not just to Palestinians, but to the region as a whole, eventually to Israel itself, to the United States, and globally. Palestinians obviously pay the biggest price. The human and material costs are immeasurable. The massive generational trauma that has been inflicted on Palestinians will reshape Palestinian society and politics in ways that we cannot even begin to predict at this stage, and sow the seeds for conflict for decades. Israel, I think this will undoubtedly come back to haunt Israelis in the medium and long term. The idea that Israeli security can come at the expense of Palestinian security and safety and well-being is completely illusory and defies not only human nature, but the history of this conflict. The US is also paying a major price. Certainly reputationally, its credibility has been shot, not just in the Arab and Muslim worlds, but across the global South and even parts of the global North. It's interesting to note, for example, that countries like Spain and Ireland have joined at least Spain has, I don't want to misspeak about Ireland, but Spain has joined the South Africa's genocide case. And so even the global North itself is the Western world is divided over this issue. And strategically, the U.S. will pay a long-term cost by being dragged into conflicts in the region, most notably the conflict with Iran. The way things are playing out in the region are not in the long-term strategic interests of the U.S. The kinds of groups that are going to emerge out of this, I think, are going to make Hamas look like Boy Scouts, just based on the scale of suffering and lawlessness that exists in Gaza in particular. And I think the damage done to the whole idea of an international rules-based order, I mean, it's just been entirely shredded. And this is not solely the fault of the United States. The U.S. is first and foremost, I think, the chief dismantler of that international order, but countries like Germany and Hungary and others are signaling, for example, that they're not going to even though they're signatories to the Rome Statute that created the international, the treaty that created the International Criminal Court, they've said that they're not going to implement the orders to arrest Netanyahu. And so these institutions that emerged out of World War II to prevent atrocities are being systematically undermined, and their future is in question. And so I'll just end there, and we can open it up to discussion.
Thank you, Khaled. Once again, our speaker brings me to tears. It's so tragic and so totally wasteful and unnecessary. All right, we shall go to the questions. I'll begin with questions that came in prior to today. Please explain why the U.S. is super funding and arming Israel with hundreds of arms transfers. You sort of answered this, but not entirely.
Yeah. Okay. You want to take them in succession, or should I?
Go ahead, go for it.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a history, obviously. The U.S.-Israel special relationship goes back to the 1960s, but really came to fruition in the 70s and 80s, where it became, Israel emerged as a kind of strategic ally of the United States. It had always been an ally, but the relationship has gotten more strategic. And so the U.S. has always maintained a commitment to Israel's survival, existence, security, all of which have been kind of conflated with one another. There were times when Israel's existence was much more precarious. This is not that time. Israel is by far the most powerful country in the region. In 1967, it was already the most powerful country in the region. It handily defeated Arab armies, combined Arab armies of three different countries in a matter of 6 days. So Israel is a regional superpower, and it has only gotten more powerful. And of course, Israel is a nuclear power. So the idea, and this is why I think the idea that Hamas or any Palestinian armed actor would pose an existential threat to Israel is on its face nonsensical. But that hasn't changed. I mean, Palestinians are at the very bottom of the strategic equation, right? If Israel's at the top, the most powerful, Palestinians are at the very, very bottom, behind all of the sovereign states and Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Palestinians are the very, very last. They don't even have a regular army. They're not a sovereign state. They don't have economic power. They don't have diplomatic power. So that asymmetry is massive, but it has not changed the way U.S. politicians look at Israel. So Israel is still widely perceived, certainly by folks of Joe Biden's generation, but also others in the political establishment, as this fragile underdog faced with obliteration at any moment. And therefore, we have to keep arming it. And there is a total blindness to the actual reality of, Israel is a regional superpower. In fact, it's one of the most powerful militaries in the world and has one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations anywhere in the world. And yet all of those weapons, those US weapons, all of the technology and intelligence could not prevent the attacks that happened on October 7th. Because ultimately, it's not about how many weapons you have and how much power, how much material, physical power you have, but about whether it's about Israel's security was tied to ultimately a political resolution. The problem with US policy is that it has invested unconditionally in Israel's development as a military and hegemonic power in the region, but ignored the political dimension or only treated it very, as a secondary priority. So one reason is strategic. Another reason is domestic politics. Um, Israel is a very popular issue, bipartisan. It generates lots of campaign finances for people who want to run for office, particularly in Congress. And so it's good domestic politics to support pretty much anything Israel wants from a military standpoint, and that is what has been legs to this special relationship. The Congress has carved out massive. Um, there are all kinds of carve outs for Israel on human rights, on Israeli exceptionalism is embedded deeply in our politics, and so look at just the other day, a Democratic Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey meets with Yoav Gallant, who has an active warrant for his arrest by the International Criminal Court. He's meeting with an indicted war criminal and posting his pictures on social media. There's no cost, right? It's to the contrary, there's a cost to not doing that. So that creates all kinds of contradictions with U.S. interests, with U.S. values. And so domestic politics, this fascination with Israel's military, people are deeply impressed. I mean, you remember after the pager attacks in Lebanon, where thousands of exploding pagers for Hezbollah members, but it included civilians, right? Teachers, civil servants, all kinds of people were killed. I think even diplomats, foreign diplomats, who had these pagers. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta called it exactly what it was, and that is an orchestrated terrorist attack. I mean, it clearly fits the definition of international terrorism. But all we saw from the Washington establishment was heaping praise. They were so impressed with the level of sophistication and, wow, what a coordinated attack and what kind of intelligence you need to have, overlooking entirely the human, moral, legal, political implications of it all. So all that stuff tends to go out the window when it comes to Israel.
Thank you. Let's see. You've touched on Lebanon. I think I will go to this next question. I was going to go to it later, but I'll ask it now. Why is the U.S. supporting bombing of Syria and Lebanon?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really, really dangerous development, I think. And I should say that as staunchly pro-Israel as every U.S. administration has been since, JFK, and they've only gotten progressively more so. There's nothing that comes close to what Joe Biden has done. I've never seen another administration that has zero red lines, this level of unconditionality, despite the massive costs in human and other terms, and even political costs. I think we cannot discount that Gaza was a factor in Kamala Harris's election loss in key parts. I mean, obviously, there's a bigger story, and they lost all of the swing states, but Gaza was a factor in keeping people home, at least young people, a lot of people of color. Were very turned off by this administration. So despite all of those costs, Biden just keeps kind of like sticking to his guns that they're going to, even Ronald Reagan had red lines. Even George W. Bush had red lines. There's a famous moment during Israel's invasion of and bombing of Lebanon in 1982, in which this was obviously before social media, but we still had the nightly news, and video images of Israel's carpet bombing of Beirut were making their way into American living rooms, including Nancy Reagan, who apparently complained about seeing, dead babies being pulled out of the rubble, and it was very disturbing. And so an angry Ronald Reagan picked up the phone, called Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and said, "What you're doing in Lebanon is a Holocaust. You have to stop." He used the word Holocaust with a literal Holocaust survivor, Menachem Begin, and Israel stopped. And Ronald Reagan was no friend of the Palestinians. He was quite hostile to the PLO and not particularly empathetic with Palestinians, but the images were enough that he was horrified. Ronald Reagan had red lines. George W. Bush had red lines, even after the 9/11 attacks. He picked up the phone and called Sharon and said, "You can't do this, you can't do that." Joe Biden hasn't done that. They've registered their complaints privately. They've sometimes leaked how angry they were. Sometimes, Biden uses swear words to refer to Netanyahu. But beyond that, they've not used any of their vast amounts of leverage. And instead, they've said, "Look, we'd rather you didn't, but even when you do, we're still going to back you up." This is unprecedented, and I think it's setting a new standard. And Syria is no different. Sorry, that's a long answer, but Syria is no different. I mean, Israel is rewriting the laws of war in Gaza, in Lebanon, and now in Syria. So Israel already occupies and has annexed the Golan Heights. And now they've invaded other parts of Syria to create, the Golan Heights was supposed to be the buffer with a hostile Syria. Now they've gone further into Syria to build a new buffer for the buffer. And at the same time, I think by estimates I've seen, they've destroyed 80% of Syria's military capabilities, taking advantage of this very precarious transition, this moment in Syrian history, when there is no consolidated regime in place, to destroy the military assets of a sovereign nation. There is no basis for this in international law. There is no preemptive offense. There's no, if every country were allowed to preemptively go after the military capabilities of their neighbors, it would be chaos. And so Israel gives itself the right. And because Biden is who he is not capable of telling Israel to stop or you've gone too far, because nothing is more important than Israel's security. Nothing. Not Palestinian lives, not Lebanese or Syrian lives or sovereignty. Nothing is more important. All of those things are subordinated to what Israel decides is in its security interests. And frankly, I've never seen another president be as blindly and unconditionally supportive of not just what Israel's doing, but remember, this is the most extreme government in Israel's history. Their vision for the region, for Gaza, for the West Bank, for Lebanon, is not the same as the Joe Biden's vision of a two-state solution. I mean, and so that's where the contradiction is, that you've given Israel a blank check to pursue its own vision that is completely at odds with your vision. And there's no appreciation for that.
It's hard to move on. Do you know what Israel's plan is for Gaza and Palestine after a ceasefire is achieved? I think you kind of alluded to that. They want it all. There's no question about it, but please.
Yeah, I think the plan for Gaza is to render it unlivable, and for as many people to leave as possible. I think we've heard there are plans already in place, and they've been talked about since October of last year. They would like to see the depopulation of Gaza from 2.2 million to maybe a million or less. The fewer Palestinians in Gaza, the better. They want to, do away with Gaza once and for all. And what they're doing in northern Gaza is the most extreme version of that. So northern Gaza is now going to be totally uninhabited and flattened. Why? Well, there are plans in place to resettle Gaza. In fact, They're on the borders of Gaza. The settlers are there waiting until they're allowed in, and they will be allowed in. There are the extremist settlers have counterparts inside, have representatives inside Israel's government, and I think that's where this is going next. Gaza is going to be gradually depopulated over time because there's just nothing left. Right? There's no economy, there's no agriculture, there are no institutions, there are no universities, there are no hospitals. So why would people stay? They'll go to Egypt, they'll go to Canada, they'll go wherever. That's not of any Israelis' concern. All that matters is that they leave. And in the north, especially, the north will be completely ethnically cleansed. I don't think there's another word for it. And probably eventually resettled by Israeli Jews. That's the vision, that's the dream. In the West Bank, the vision is annexation, formal annexation that would be recognized by the United States and then, imposed, therefore, on the rest of the international community, because even Europe, wisely or unwisely, has consistently deferred to Washington on Israel-Palestine issues. They talk a good talk about international law and a two-state solution and all that, but at the end of the day, they allow Washington to do what it does, and so even Europe will acquiesce in that new reality. So the question is, what kind of annexation? Are we looking at just Area C, 60% of the West Bank? Are we looking at all of the West Bank minus, the little pockets of Palestinian cities, and which would essentially be little Bantustans? But what happens next? I think the ultimate dream for the West Bank is the same as Gaza, to encourage, through whatever, siege, starvation, war, mass arrests, home demolitions, displacement, to encourage people to leave. That is the long-term vision, is to empty the West Bank and Gaza of Palestinians. They've gotten a really gotten off to a very strong start in Gaza, where at least a third is going to be entirely emptied, and then the rest probably gradually emptied of Palestinians. And the threat of annexation and the total clampdown on every aspect of Palestinian life in the West Bank will make it very difficult for them to leave. And the hope is that they'll eventually go to Jordan. If not all of them, then some significant portion of them, and then be rid of this Palestinian issue once and for all, because that's the only option. Before October 7th, people, analysts like me would say, look, there's only two options for some kind of a settlement. There's a two-state solution in which you partition the land and you have two states in different parts, and that involves compromises and whatever. We know what that looks like because that's been studied ad nauseum. We know what land swaps would look like. We know what the map would look like. Okay, that's one, two sovereign states. The other option is it's all one state. It's all under control of a single state, but with equal citizenship rights for everyone. And neither of those has been acceptable to Israel. So the only other options, which are not solutions but are still possible outcomes, are ethnic cleansing or genocide. And we used to say that as a warning in the past. Now both of them are set in motion already. They are happening on the ground. Even the former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon, who's obviously not a dove, not a Palestinian nationalist, is calling what is happening in northern Gaza now ethnic cleansing and war crimes. So there is starting to be some realization in Israel that this extremist government is going too far, but is it enough to restrain it? I'm not so sure, especially when there are no restraints coming from the outside, from the US in particular. And now with the Trump administration coming in, we're going to see even fewer constraints on Israel.
Well, you just kind of answered the next question. I think I'll skip that and go on. Do you recognize the revision of October 7th, including the likelihood that the IDF killed about or more than half of the Israelis killed? And then it says Hannibal directive, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen those reports, and I think there are a lot of questions about what exactly happened. We know that the official narrative that came out in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, in the weeks and even months afterwards, was not accurate. Um, so all the stories about the beheaded babies, I think, that's obviously been debunked, and people put in ovens and all of that stuff. Pregnant mothers with their bellies sliced open. I mean, all of these atrocities. I mean, October 7th was full of atrocities, no question. They were horrible enough without needing to embellish and add, make up new things. But it was all part of the narrative to dehumanize Palestinians and to justify the scale of Israel's response and the atrocities that followed. Um, so we know that certain aspects of that narrative have already been debunked. We know that hundreds of non-civilians, soldiers and police, were among those killed, in addition to about 800 civilians. We know that many of those civilians killed were killed by Israeli forces. I think particularly in that concert that was being held adjacent to Gaza's borders, where there were so many young people, and we saw the incinerated cars and bodies afterwards. Hamas doesn't have the capability to incinerate whole areas. This was clearly actions taken by the Israeli security forces of one type or another. So we're starting to get word out. Word is starting to trickle out little by little of what did and didn't happen, but we don't really have a sense of this full scale. We know that the Israeli authorities did that many of the Israeli civilians killed were killed by Israeli forces, but we just don't know exactly how many. We don't know the scale of these things yet, and I think that is one reason why, and one of the many reasons why, Netanyahu and the Israeli security establishment is not that eager to push for a formal commission of inquiry. I think a commission of inquiry will have to eventually uncover those facts. And I think the surest way to prevent those facts is just to delay or postpone that sort of inquiry for as long as possible. And then memories fade, documents are lost, records are misplaced. I mean, right, a lot can happen in the now more than a year since then. And so if you want to preserve the record, the time to do it was immediately after. If you want to destroy the record, well, there's plenty of time to do that. So it's not clear exactly if, when, or how the exact nature of what took place on October 7th is going to come out. But we know for sure that it is not the official Israeli narrative. And so, yes, the Hannibal
Directive, I guess it was called.
directive is a real thing, but we don't know to what extent it was actually activated on that day. But I think future scholars, if not an actual commission of inquiry, will bring it out. But it will be too late as far as having
History will prove it out, but at the cost of many more
at the
lives.
at the cost of lives and new realities on the ground, and it may not even convince people, right? Because we live in a world where everyone can have their alternate reality. We live in informational bubbles, at least we can, and so there are still people out there who say there is no starvation in Gaza, that all of this stuff isn't really happening,
Mhm.
and that it's Pallywood, they call it.
Well,
Uh,
same thing happened during the Holocaust, didn't it? On the other side of it.
Yeah, the irony
Deniers,
was it
deniers.
was yeah, exactly, and
Yeah.
the irony is that in the Holocaust we didn't have social media, we didn't have people reporting from inside Auschwitz, live streams happening from the death camps. We didn't have those things. We had to wait for afterwards for us to find out what happened. We have that information happening in real time, and yet people are still denying it. This is, the human capacity to rationalize and to be in denial is almost limitless.
Khaled, I'm going to move to the next question. We have maybe 10 minutes left and a few questions here. I'm going to pick and choose a little bit here. It has been reported that Israel knew what Hamas was planning. Do you agree, and why would they allow the attack to happen?
Yeah, so the evidence that is coming out now shows that there were signs. Intelligence, there were low and mid-level Israeli intelligence officials who had flagged certain things happening in Gaza. They said, and they kicked it up to their superiors, and it didn't go anywhere. But there were signs that were being picked up. I don't know that the historical record will show that the prime minister knew exactly what was going to happen and deliberately allowed it to take place. I don't think history will bear that out. Um, but I do think it's already showing that there were signs that were ignored, and these signs were not small. They knew they were training with paragliders. They knew, there were, I forget the details, but there have been reports out there um, that certain signs were being picked up. But intelligence is only as good as the humans who consume it, right? Who produce it and supposedly decide what to do with it. And they decided that this was just a training exercise. It wasn't going to go anywhere and wasn't going to do anything. So again, I think the lesson here, yes, there's an intelligence failure, and the Israeli security establishment will have to account for that. But the lesson here is that all the intelligence in the world, and remember, Gaza was the most heavily surveilled place on earth, and we're not talking like 9/11 intelligence failure, where people plotting in a cave, 10,000 miles away. This is right under Israel's nose, literally in the Gaza Strip. They've got drones in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They've got every single man, woman, and child cell electronic communications are intercepted in Gaza. And so there's no reason for them to not have seen this coming. But again, all of the security, all of the intelligence in the world is pointless if you don't have a certain mindset. And I think that's where the failures happened, and where I think future scholars and historians will put the blame.
I'm going to, I think we have one time for one more question, and I'm going to add a final question to this question. Possibly younger people are less enamored by Israel and its Zionist policy, question, or maybe emerging countries in Africa or elsewhere will have less of a Zionist outlook and treat the Middle East conflicts more fairly, question. And I will add, is there anything that gives you hope? Um, I guess I'm adding that because I'm wondering if
Yeah.
our youth around the world are the hope.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, for me, the young people are the hope, and it's not just young people in the region, um, but especially young people in North America and Europe and the West, where despite their pretty awful stances taken by many of their governments, including very draconian and repressive measures against student protesters, attempts to criminalize. In Germany, I think is one of the worst examples of this, where they're criminalizing basically Palestinian narratives. Like if you talk about the Nakba of 1948, that is anti-Semitism now. If you talk about Israeli war crimes and or ethnic cleansing or genocide, that is anti-Semitism. And these definitions are being adopted in the U.S. on campuses and state legislatures, and so despite all this repression, and maybe because of it, on some level, young people are not buying the old narratives. And I think that's the single biggest change that we've seen in the last 100 years. And Rashid Khalidi, probably the premier Palestinian historian ever, speaks very articulately on this issue, that there's like a Rubicon has been crossed. And this is the first generation in 100 years that does not look at the issue through a distinctly Israeli Zionist lens. And that is what is bringing on all of this repression. Because now, if you've lost the hearts and minds, especially of an entire generation, well, then all you're left with is you have to legislate it. So I can't tell you what to believe in your heart, but I can prevent you from saying it out loud. On your campus or in your, wherever. And that's where I think the change is going to happen. So the thing that does give me hope is that we now have a generation that is highly politicized, and that have, not only do they not buy into the old narratives that Israel is the underdog and that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East or the moral army in the world, all of those are now in the past, but they are also intensely politicized by what they've seen over the last 14 months. You cannot unsee, we've all heard the audio of Hind Rajab in the car when she was surrounded by Israeli soldiers and the paramedics who came were picked off one by one. We've heard that audio. We've seen the images, and we can't unsee or unhear those. And I think that's the one thing that gives me hope, is that, while we are seeing the institutionalized dehumanization of Palestinians, we're also seeing at a grassroots level efforts to rehumanize Palestinians and to emphasize their humanity, even at great personal costs. The fact that young people are willing to risk their careers, their education on this, I think it is becoming the defining issue for this generation.
And we are seeing some younger legislators like AOC and our Ilhan Omar, who are resisting AIPAC pressure.
And I would also add that this change that is generational cuts across ideologies and communities. Yeah. There is a similar generational divide inside the Jewish community. Some of the most important Palestine solidarity events are organized by Jews. I mean, when they shut down Grand Central Station in New York, or when they, were in the U.S. Capitol, groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace. This debate is happening inside the Jewish community. It's even happening among evangelicals. Younger evangelicals are not sentimentally as attached to Israel in the unconditional way that their parents and grandparents are. So we don't yet see the fruits of that change because young people are not in positions of power. But I think it's inevitable that it will make its way upward as they make their way into those public spaces.
I agree with you, and I share in that hope. most certainly. I wish we had more time for questions. This is an amazing conversation that could go on and on and on.